So I will flash that again before the last section. So, John,
Yeah.
I think you will introduce our speaker.
Good morning once again. Just a brief introduction of Attorney Luke Espiritu. He asked me, is there anybody, we have dignitaries here that he needs to recognize? I said, there's no bishops, no cardinal, no monsignor in this group. So I said, that's good. So si Attorney Luke finishes elementary education in La Salle and in college and high school in Ateneo de Manila and graduated Juris Doctor in the Ateneo de Manila School of Law. Currently is the National President of the Bukluran ng Manggagawa ng Pilipino. And I think in the first week of October, he filed his COC candidate, Certificate of Candidacy for Senator of the Philippines. So I think we said there, this is now the time that we need to look around. Early in the morning, we look at ourselves, but this is part of our looking around. So I'd like to introduce Luke to you to help us look at the current context of the Philippines, in the context of the coming elections, in the context of the political dynasties that's vying for power, in the context of the fight between evil and kasamaan at kadiliman, evil and darkness. So how do we understand the fight between evil and darkness? So hopefully Luke gave us framework to understand.
Give us the light.
So we'll give Luke, this is yours.
Thank you, Brother John, for the short introduction. Because others, when I get invited, it's a kilometric type of introduction. It contains my entire life story. Anyway, hello. Okay. Press long. Okay. Now, I think there is one thing that was left out. And in the introduction, which is not really very well known, is the fact that the religious life has influenced me even until now. When I was young, growing up in Negros, I saw the priest in our province. And that's the reason why I also knew Father Gore. Yes, I knew him since I was a child. We visited him in prison. And ever since, he made a mark in my consciousness. I would always tell stories about how the priests have influenced me because in Negros at the time, it was during the Marcos dictatorship, it was the church that defended the poor and oppressed. The priest in our hometown, when I listen to their sermons, it's about social issues. It's about farmers being killed, human rights abuses. And the fact that we must struggle in order for us to be true to the teachings of the church, and liberation theology was called the thing at the time. If we have to be true to the teachings of the church and to the life example of Jesus Christ, we must have that preferential option for the poor, and we cannot but get involved in the solutions to their poverty and their oppression and their exploitation, and we must address the social ills of the society. I learned that from the priest, and I learned that from the example of priests in our hometown who organized peasants. And my father, in fact, has a narrative that is close to Father Gore's narrative, because at the time there was this warlord Pablo Sola in Kabangkalan, and it was my father who was one of the prosecutors against Pablo Sola. And we know that Pablo Sola was killed, and that's the reason why Father Gore was jailed by the Marcos regime on trumped-up charges. And I knew at the time that they were, correct me if I'm wrong, Father Gore, you were organizing the Cristiano Katilupan in Kabangkalan, and that's the reason why he was jailed. And those words, those stories, the images and the sounds of my youth in Negros, a lot of which is dominated by the examples of our priests and our nuns who fought against exploitation. They filled my imagination. And therefore, when I went on to become a high school student in the Ateneo, in Ateneo they offer, even in high school, a course named Liberation Theology. They teach us Liberation Theology. It also crystallized my idea of what the church should do. And I dreamed of becoming a priest, actually. And I did enter the seminary. And even until now, that influence, religious influence, which is not born out of simply undertaking rituals for the purification of my soul, if I have to characterize my religiosity, it was really about social justice. And I think that influenced me even until now as I became a labor leader. And I was so glad that I was invited here in order to talk about our national situation. Meaning to say, it closely follows what has been that tradition of the church. This gathering closely follows what has been the tradition of the church during that time, which is to have a preferential option for the poor. Otherwise, why would we talk about national situation? That it is part of our religious life, our mission, as the people of God, as the people of the kingdom of God, to actually bring the ideals of that kingdom on earth, not simply in heaven. And that's the reason why we're going to talk about the national situation. And I think this is also connected to the program. We are talking about our national situation because we are going to link it with the topic of towards the democratic movement from below. Okay? Now, I was given an invitation, and according to the invitation, I am going to talk about the national situation in the context of the upcoming elections, the political dynasties, EJK, human rights abuse, and climate emergency. Pretty much covers everything. But I would like to provide you with a framework wherein we could relate all of the things that's happening in our country. And nothing can describe it more than the fact that during the filing of the certificates of candidacy for the 2025 elections, everyone who's known and in our political landscape, they all belong to political dynasties. They belong to the political clans, they have the same names. Like if, for example, in the Senate right now, we have a Senator Tulfo, and now we have two Tulfos, brothers that will be running for a senatorial post, and they are on the top tier of the national surveys, meaning to say, it's almost sure that they're going to be senators. So after 2025, we will have 3 Senator Tulfos in the Senate of the Philippines. We have a Senator Mark Villar right now, currently sitting in the present Congress, and the sister will now run. And she will become senator because she's also included in the top 12 surveys. So it's almost sure, with all the resources of that family, it's almost sure that we're going to have 2 Villars. And the other one is an outgoing senator. She's going to be replaced by the daughter. Okay? And we will have 2 Cayetanos. And it's a good thing that Rodrigo Duterte and Baste Duterte did not run for the Senate. Because initially, among the list of prospective candidates, they would have run, the two of them. Not only the two of them, three of them. And they would have had a chance of winning. So what has become of this country? It has become a country controlled by families, clans, in the national level. Because before this fairly recent development, when you talk about political dynasties, you look at the local areas where they started. They started in the local area. They control towns and municipalities and cities, and they monopolize the resources there and political power and public monies in that area. They kill political opponents. They repress, suppress opposition. They oppress the masses, and they are forcing their re-election every 3 years by use of bribery, by use of violence, by use of control, all types of control, by cheating in the elections. And before, it was more confined to the local areas, confined there. At the national level, you could at least see some names that are there without any other family member occupying the same position. But right now, it has become worse. Like right now, the political dynasties have already taken over the national positions, senators, and now, our political landscape, our national political electoral situation is that the main dividing line between the so-called administration and the so-called opposition, it is now dominated by two families in our country. Like we have the Marcoses and we have the Dutertes. Before it was not like that. So meaning to say, our system of politics controlled by our family clans, our political dynasties, which were confined to the local areas before, they have now gone national. It has become worse. And there's a reason for this. And the reason for this is, I would say, and I would state it at the outset, that's the kind of result that you will expect if the mass movement is weak. Because if the mass movement is weak, then the power of these political clans and dynasties, it will just increase to such an extent that they would control the national positions. And I would also like to point out that their power is so unchecked and their exercise so unbridled that they have reached a point that they could actually arrogate to themselves the privilege of acting stupid and crazy. It becomes a privilege to act illogically, unreasonably, in fact even idiotic. That becomes the privilege of the powerful. Look at the monarchs of old times. When you become an absolute monarch, you could actually indulge in any crazy pastime. You could actually afford to do crazy things. Why? Because you are not accountable to opposition. There is no force that is capable of unseating you. So what's the effect? The effect is you're gonna abuse your power to the point of becoming crazy. And if you look at the Senate right now on how the senators conduct themselves, you could already see that they are arrogating to themselves the same privilege of acting crazy, stupid, and idiotic. Pardon my words. But it's true. Like a few weeks ago, we have two senators who almost got into a fist fight in front of the cameras because they were bickering about control in the local areas, factional fight in their local base. They almost got into a fist fight. And should I even mention our number one senator, Robin Padilla, on how he conducts himself in the Senate? Like in a Senate hearing, he would comb his mustache. And have you heard about his idea of women's issues? How he articulates his idea on things relating to women. He said that men have sexual rights over their spouses. And what will you do if our sexual urges can no longer be controlled? And according to him, he was trying to point out that, if we have urges, it's the duty of a woman to help us. This is a matter of right. In the 21st century, where women's rights have already advanced everywhere, except perhaps in the Philippines, right? But everywhere else, women's rights have advanced. In the 21st century, where women, the LGBTQ+, make claims upon this society, in order this society can also become fairer, more just to women, to the LGBTQ+. In this day and time, you will hear in the Senate of the Philippines a senator talking about his urges. That's the most important thing when you talk about women's rights. So they have already gone to a low point that, ironically, it betrays the strength of the power of the political dynasties. It indicates that no one else can oppose them. It indicates to the fact that the mass movement is so weak. And there's no opposition against these ruling dynasties. Because if you hark back to history, when things were not yet that absurd, like I would say several decades ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago, those who are in our parliaments, our senators, our congressmen, you know what they were talking about? Perhaps in the 60s and the 70s, they were talking about the social volcano. And what is that social volcano? They were pointing to the inevitability of revolution. That was what they were talking about. And they were proposing social reforms. They knew that they are constrained to talk about social reforms. That was in the days gone by, in the 60s and the 70s, when farmers were fighting, when workers were fighting, when the mass movement was relative to now quite stronger. So, in a condition, in a situation where the oppressed classes of our society, they have gained relative strength relative to those who rule that society, if they have gained relative strength, that would also be the time that reason will reign. Reason, not craziness, not these absurd things that are happening right now. Reason will reign. They were talking about land reform. Because in their own discourse, if we do not redistribute land, there will be revolution. If we do not modernize our economy, and there were politicians that were for land reform, even if they themselves were landlords. They were for modernizing Philippine economy, meaning to say we should delve into production. We must redistribute land, because if we redistribute land, then the farmers will have all the access to the wealth generated by that land, and therefore if they will have control over the fruits of the land, the wealth generated by that, then they could at least absorb our industrial output. Therefore, it is possible for us to industrialize. That was the discourse then. They were talking about modernizing Philippine economy. Again, because of the social volcano. They were grappling with the question of revolution. And And the question of revolution was very important in order to constrain the elite, in order to force the elite to address the questions that are besetting the masses, the problems that the masses are suffering, to address these important things, to address reform, to change their ways, to curb their abuse. If there is that threat from below, if there is a threat of revolution from below, that's the only time that they will be forced to do the right things. Compared to now, when there is no such threat. We do not talk about social volcano. Of course, there's no threat of revolution because compared to before, our mass movement is relatively weak. I will describe to you the condition of the workers. Like I am in the labor movement. I have been in the labor movement for years. I'm the president of the Bukluran ng Manggagawang Pilipino. And you know, when we organize workers, I could see a general sense of hopelessness and desperation. Why? Because the workers of today in the Philippines, they have been condemned into thinking merely about their own survival because of the level of oppression that they experience. In the workers in the Philippines today, are composed of contractual workers. They are in the majority. What do we mean by contractual workers? You go to a place where you work, and then we call them the principal. The principal will say, you are not my employee. You work there, but you are not my employee. There's no employer-employee relationship between us. Why? Because according to the principal, you are an employee of a third party, the one who hired you and deployed you to this place to work. And why is that? That person is a stranger. That third party is a stranger, doesn't have any contribution to production, doesn't even have anything to do with how the worker is supervised or managed, the direction does not emanate from the third party. How is it that he is the employer? How is it that this third party, which we call the manpower agency, how is it that that manpower agency is now the employer? You know why? It's because of the government who created that fiction, that legal fiction, which is simply absurd. They declared through their own issuances, the Department of Labor, that employer-employee relationship does not exist between the worker and the principal. It exists between the worker and the manpower agency that has nothing to do at all with production, that is a complete stranger, and is merely there in order to present a paper, I will say paper, a simulated type of a relationship, completely false, completely simulated, that they are the employer. So what's the effect? The effect is, and majority of the Filipino workers are like that, and I would say, from my time in organizing on the ground, I would say that they consist of about 70 to 80% of the Filipino worker today. 70 to 80%, majority are what we call contractual worker. In other countries, they call them precarious workers. And their problem is, the most fundamental right is being denied to them, and that is simply recognition that you are an employee. That's the most basic, where all other rights will come into play if that is recognized. But if you are not recognized as an employee or as a worker, then you have zero rights. You don't even exist. It's like you're not being recognized as a human being. If you're not recognized as a human being, then you don't have any human rights. If you're considered a non-entity, nothing, you simply sprung from the earth, from the air, then you would not have any rights at all. You could even be killed. And that's the problem of a majority of Filipino workers. They are not given that legal recognition that they are workers. Majority of them, therefore, have no rights. They can be removed anytime. And if you are a contractual worker, you have to suffer the level of wages in this country, which, without any exception, is below the poverty threshold. You know, wages in this country are merely consist of about 50% or lower of the cost of living. According to the latest figures that I have access to, the cost of living in this country would amount to around 1,207 pesos per day. 1,207. The highest level of wage, because the wages in our country, they are different per region. The highest would be the National Capital Region. The wage in the National Capital Region would be 640, correct? 640 pesos. So compared to the needs of the workers, computed at 1,207 pesos, the highest level of wage, which is in the National Capital Region, would simply be 50%. And it is even worse in the provinces, worse in the other regions, because they receive wages ranging from 300 plus to 400 pesos, which will already be simply less than 1/4, or about 1/4 or 1/3 of what they need every day in order to survive. So what's the effect? What's the effect? Because if you have that kind of wage, what will happen? Workers will have to work longer hours. They will have to work longer hours beyond their 8-hour work because they need 1,207 minimum, and they just receive 600, 500, 400, 300. They would have to earn more in order to cover the difference because they are forced to cover the difference. If you need 1,207 and you only have 600, what will you do? It cannot be that you'll no longer eat, right? You will still have to spend for food. You will still have to spend for electricity. You will still have to spend for transportation. The most basic requirements for you in order to survive, you are still forced to do that. So in order to cover for the difference, you have to work longer hours. You have to abuse your own body and treat yourself no longer as a human being, but as an animal. And you have to go on overtime, and many of our workers go on overtime for 4 more hours, and still, they would not earn enough for their own sustenance. So what will they do? They will still go out of the workplace, and they will engage in what we call the gig economy, which is now a rising economic sector in our society. They will drive Lalamove, Grab, Food Panda for 5 more hours, and when they get home, they no longer have time for themselves, but they would still not earn enough. They will still have to look for ways by borrowing money. That the Filipino worker now is the most indebted. If you ask them, who among them would pawn their ATMs? Do you know that in this country, they use their ATMs in order to borrow money, and they surrender their ATMs as security for the repayment of what they owe. And so on and so forth. Many things that they have to combine, survival techniques that they have to combine in order to supplement the meager salary that they receive. And what's the result? The result of that? Then we have now a entire class force, the workers, the proletariat, which is the most, important class force in society in order to push for democratic and systemic changes, as history would show. You have now a proletariat, a working class, that is condemned to survival. You would have a proletariat that has no time. That has no time even to think about their own oppression. You will have a proletariat that cannot fight back because they have to feed their families. You have a proletariat that cannot be drawn into political action. Unlike before, that the proletariat, the working class, would, if they're drawn into political action, a lot of things will change. But right now, because they don't even have the time to think, they don't even have the time to sleep, their preoccupation, that the moment they wake until they sleep, is about earning an extra buck, an extra peso, in order to feed their families, then what do you have? You have in a perfect condition for entire society, the entire exploited class. You have a situation where you have an entire exploited class that will simply remain docile, passive, and cannot fight back. And that's a perfect recipe for our political dynasties to thrive. Father Gore and I were talking a while ago, and what do? They give for peace. They give dole-outs. And what's the effect of those dole-outs? It is disempowering. It creates dependencies. It creates power for the ruling class, for the ruling elite. And once that happens, when you have an entire proletarian class, and if you have an entire proletarian class that is oppressed, you will have an entire exploited class, regardless of which sector, that will simply remain docile, that will be tied to survival, that will have no time for political thought, for critical thinking even, for political action. They cannot even fight for their own rights, which is reflected when we go down to organized workers. The first instinct that they will show you, or first reaction to you as an organizer, is fear. They're afraid to release themselves from their own chains. And so, I would describe this situation as a perfect condition for what I would term as the Philippine Stockholm Syndrome. What do I mean? You see, this is a situation where the oppressed, as a response to their oppression, to the abuse of power, would see no hope. And if they see no hope, then it will result into what is akin to a Stockholm Syndrome, which is that the oppressed will embrace their oppressors. Because there's no hope. The oppressed will embrace their oppressors and will love their own chains. You're familiar with Stockholm Syndrome, right? The Patty Hearst story. She was like kidnapped. She joined her kidnappers. She embraced and loved her own captors. And that is what is happening in our country on a social scale, where the oppressed, because of desperation, lack of hope, will vote every elections, will vote and patronize and champion their own oppressors. In this country, if you are a worker, and here comes a candidate who would most likely come from the bourgeois class, who would most likely be capitalist, and you're a worker, most likely that capitalist will win from the worker vote. And on the reverse, we who are labor leaders, and it's not only I who is running for a senatorial post, like right now I could count 5 or 6 from the labor movement. And we don't get to the top surveys. We are at the very bottom. And yet we are labor leaders. We represent the workers. We point the way. We tell, we advocate wages that, that are living wages. We advocate the abolition of the manpower agencies and for regular work. We advocate everything that is just for the working man. And yet we hit the bottom of the service. And it is those capitalists, those who own the factories, who own businesses that oppress the workers, that will win. So, capitalists being voted by the proletariat. Landless voting for land grabbers. Landless. Those who are being thrown off the land. Farmers who are victims of land grabbing. Urban poor communities who are victims of land grabbing. Okay? They will vote for the number one land grabber in this country, who would be the Villar family. We have a community like that in Cavite. Sitio Malipay. And Sitio Malipay, there is an ongoing struggle against land grabbing by the Villars. And then Mark Villar won in that place. Number 5. We who fought for that community, we didn't even reach top 20. Right? So how can you explain that? How can you explain the fact that the proletariat will vote for the capitalists who exploit them, the landless poor, victims of land grabbing, even farmers who are victims of land grabbing, will still vote for the number one land grabber in this country? And so on and so forth. And there is no exception. Those who win in the elections, they are the ones who represent exploitation of the poor. They are the ones who represent abuse of workers' rights. They are the ones who will also commit killings from the local areas, will support extrajudicial killings, will do nothing. Nothing. They have done nothing actually during the Duterte time, because Duterte was president. It's only now that they are going against Duterte, but it is not because of their love for human rights. It's because of the political conditions that the current administration, like now, the Marcos administration, is going after Duterte, that our lawmakers, our politicians are now emboldened to investigate the extrajudicial killings, but before they were mum, they were silent, complicit, and even agreed to it, and contributed to its popularity. Because despite the fact that it was really an exercise in impunity, victimizing the poor, killing without compunction, it was a popular measure during Duterte's time. And they are the ones who's going to do that, who's going to kill. And yet they will gain power from the support of those who are from below. Now, I would like also to add that this kind of a situation or governance, this type of a government, this type of a system run by the dynasties and the political class, who are oppressive of those who are at the bottom, this will also be the kind of government that can never address our serious problems. Never. And I will point to two things that we are now facing. And these two things are existential problems. It is problems that entire humanity faces. I'm referring to two things. First would be the climate emergency. I will just give some broad strokes about that. That scientists have already said that if we do not keep within 1.5 degrees by 2030, meaning to say, our threshold for global warming must not go beyond 1.5 degrees based on pre-industrial levels. Because if we go beyond 1.5 degrees, we would have breached the scientific limit. That's why it is not a target. We don't put targets. It is a limit imposed upon us by nature. that if we do not keep within 1.5 degrees, by 2030, everything will be irreversible. Like, if we breach, even if we don't breach 1.5 degrees, our coral reefs would already be gone, 90%. Our coastal areas will be flooded, permanently be claimed by the sea. Island nations will disappear. The Philippines, which is an archipelago, would experience the same problem. Like we are already seeing that in Bulacan. There's permanent flooding already in Bulacan. They're already suffering the consequences of climate change. We would not have any capacity to feed ourselves because agriculture will be affected. Like there was a heat wave in March or April, May. Like it affected our agricultural areas. Like make it worse, then even feeding ourselves will become impossible. We could no longer sustain food crops that can sustain human life. And it is already existential, meaning to say, it goes into the very question of extinction. And they're using the word extinction. These scientists, there is what we call an extinction rebellion. Scientists are also organizing a scientist rebellion or revolt. Like if you see that, if you see scientists already, like using words revolt and extinction, you must be worried, right? They're scientists, meaning to say they have, they possess the data, the scientific knowledge. They are people of the best minds. When they make conclusions, these are not exaggerated conclusions. And if they are using words like extinction, and they're willing to revolt, that means things are not good. That means we are really in danger as a human species. And second would be war. It's another threat that we have. Like we have now 3 wars. One impending, 2 actual wars in the Ukraine and Russia, in the Middle East. And the main theater of this global war, which if we have to look at its connection, it is about imperialism, the system of US imperialism, trying to survive. And the only way to survive is actually to war, to go to war. And the center of gravity of this evolving global conflagration, the center of gravity would be here in Asia. The decisive confrontation is between China and the United States. China preserving, the United States preserving its imperialist control over the entire capitalist system as against the threat China, which is a rising power. And it will be here. And the Philippines is in the center of that potential or impending war. And do I have to point out that this conflict, and they're talking about World War III, it's no longer like a word that is not being used. They are using the words potential World War III. And do I have to emphasize that as compared to the 2 other world wars, we are facing here a different kind of weapon that before was not available in World War I and World War II. We're talking about nuclear bombs. And like Russia has ordered, Putin has ordered the manufacture of nuclear weapons that before it banned from producing because of what's happening in Asia. And we have these problems. Climate emergency on the one hand, war on the other, and our government is like that. Our government is run by troubles. Our government is run by political clans who have nothing at all to show for their power. They are not responsive and they don't address real problems, and their only preoccupation is to generate more power and to generate more wealth from their control and hold of public office, and from that public office, they have control over the resources, they have all the control of the public funds, they reproduce their own rule every elections. They are also the source of electoral fraud. The clans, the political clans and the dynasties are the reason why there's electoral fraud. Because that's one of the ways by which they could reproduce and regenerate their power, manipulate the elections. They're also the source of corruption because they need the resources and the money in order to maintain themselves. They're also the source of the killings because they need to sow fear and threaten people who do not support them. And that's their only purpose of existence. And do we expect them that when these threats become real, they're already real, but when they can no longer be ignored, like the climate emergency and the threat of war, do we expect them to be able to address those? And if we do not expect them to address those, it is impossible. Impossible. As I said, they have already reached the point that it is a privilege for them to act crazy and idiotic. What kind of a response are they going to do? They are not equipped even to address the yearly typhoons that visit our country. They're not even equipped to do that. Much less could they be equipped to tackle problems about climate emergency or to tackle problems regarding war. So what will happen to us if we do not change this thing? We will simply face these problems, perhaps with body counts, deaths, because they are inutile relative to these problems. And so I would like to end with, it is really in the interest of humanity, I would say, humanity, for Philippine society, that we must empower the oppressed from below. Because if we do not empower the oppressed from below, then we could already see that this type of a government run by the dynasties and the political class, the Filipino elite, the version of our elite class, they will just lead us to destruction. And I think I should end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atty. Espiritu. So now, we will have a bus session. This is a short discussion with the people beside you. Our question will be, in bus session. Before you go to the open forum, you would have some time to reflect on this. Yeah. Okay? So we'll have 5 minutes. Just discuss with the person beside you or the person in front of you at your back. You don't have to report later on. Just discuss what resonated with you in the discussion, in the input of Atty. Espiritu.
Rex, naka-on ba ito? Baka ma-video ko.